What's up guys, Agent here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Dragonknight tank. So it's still one of the best tanks in the game right now among the 6 different classes. Not much has actually changed between Dragonhold and Harrowstorm. There were a total of 8 new sets that were released, 3 sets and 1 Must-Time set for each of the 2 dungeons, but none of them really changed the meta all too much when it comes to pretty much any of the 3 roles. These new sets, they didn't really sort of beat out any of the existing sets, and none of the real balance changes that were introduced, for the few that were introduced for skills, they didn't really change anything up for the meta. So not much really has been altered between Dragonhold and Harrowstorm, so this build's actually very similar to what you have seen last patch in Dragonhold. There were obviously going to be a few tweaks here and there, but for the most part, if you have a DK tank that you played in Dragonhold, there's not much you need to change going into Harrowstorm. So like the rest of our build videos, this will not be going over any sort of gear. That is reserved for the tank gear and sort of generic information video, which will be popping up in the upper right hand corner right about now. So if you're interested in knowing what gear you should be running as a tank, go ahead and check out that video. This video will be focusing in on the skills, as well as just kind of a cursory look at how you want to approach tanking and how you want to approach tanking as a Dragonknight. So let's go ahead and get started here first with our front bar. This is the sword and board bar here. So we have Ransack, so this gives us the minor protection. So unlike a couple other classes in the game, we don't have a native source of minor protection, so we will need to use Ransack or Temporal Guard in order to get the minor protection. It's only 8% damage mitigation, but it's still a little bit of mitigation that you wouldn't normally have otherwise, so it's always nice to be able to get additional mitigation. Now you can also run the other morph of Puncture, which is Pierced Armor, which provides Major Breach. Generally speaking, you won't really need this in an organized group because you will have a healer running Ellie Drain already for the Minor Lifesteal and Major Breach. So Pierced Armor kinda you won't really need for organized groups, but for non-organized groups you might want to consider picking up Pierced Armor just to make sure you have Major Breach for your DPS. The next skill is Heroic Slash for the Minor Maim and the Minor Heroism. Just gets us our Warhorn faster with more ultimate. Next, we have Igneous Shield. You can also run the other morph here. Igneous will give you the larger damage shield for yourself. The other morph, which is known as Fragmented Shield, will increase the duration of Major Mending. Generally speaking, it doesn't really matter which one you pick. I like both. I've played with both. Fragmented Shield just gives you a little bit more healing done, which is pretty useful for Green Dragon Blood, and if you have any heal over times going out, those will definitely be beneficial. But Igneous Shield also gives you larger shields, which essentially act as secondary health. You do get the Major Mending still, it's just for a shorter period of time, and usually you will be using Igneous Shield less so to kind of maintain Major Mending, more for the ultimate, so you're already going to be casting it every 6 seconds anyways, so it's not that big of a difference between these two morphs, so pick whichever one is most comfortable for you. Then we have Green Dragon Blood. This is obviously just your self-heal. Really strong self-heal, one of the strongest in the game, and it also provides Major Fortitude, Major Endurance, and Minor Vitality, so you get a lot out of Green Dragon Blood along with all of your Draconic Power passives. Next we have a flex spot here. I have Energy Orb for the heal as well as the combustion synergy. We are running Symphony of Blade, so we do need some way to heal other people, so Energy Orb is the way we are going about doing that. You do have a couple of other options, which we will cover in a few minutes. Then for our ultimate, we are running Reviving Barrier for the additional 10% Magicka regen from the Magicka Aid passive. However, you do have a few options here. We'll go over those again in a few minutes. For our backbar, this is the either Destruction Staff or Bow backbar. We have Inner Rage as a ranged taunt. We have Balance for our Major Resolve plus our Magicka Sustain. Then we have a couple of flex spots, so we do have Choking Talons here. This is a hard CC. We have Blockade of Storms in order to proc our enchants. If you're running the Bow backbar, you'd be running Endless Hail instead. Then we have Unrelenting Grip. This is to pull enemies towards you, so that way you can gather them all up and get your DPS to AoE them all down. And then finally we have Aggressive Horn for the Major Force. Now both Unrelenting Grip and Choking Talons are only useful in trash pulls, so for boss fights you will want to swap these abilities out, unless there are adds that you definitely want to pull in. during these boss fights. For example, against Tasasha, the first boss in Maw of Lorcage, you might want to consider holding on to Talons and your chains because they do summon adds that you do need to chain in and Talons to keep in place so your DPS can burn them down. Now in terms of other abilities, let's go ahead and go down the list here. Engulfing Flames was changed recently, so the additional bonus damage to flame damage does scale off of your spell damage and max magicka. So right now you can see that we have 5% additional damage done. When we are buffed up, this is probably going to jump to about 6 or 7% depending on your specific gear setup and or your stats and your obviously your race and things like that. So you don't really see DK tanks really running Engulfing Flames any longer. It's still possible to get the max 10% bonus damage, but you will need to kind of shift your build around a little bit in order to get to that 10% additional bonus damage. Generally speaking, if you are in a situation where you have to run Engulfing Flames because you have a lot of magic DPS, you'll have a Magicka DK who will also be running Engulfing Flames, so there's really no need to run Engulfing Flames any longer on a DK tank. We have Cauterize here. This is a heal, not just a self-heal, but can also heal other people as well. Not a particularly strong heal, so it launches a healing fireball essentially every 5 seconds for only, in this case, 3.5k. So pretty small, not really all that useful, and I personally don't recommend tanks run Cauterize too much. Under the Draconic power line, a lot of these abilities are pretty useful. So Volatile Armor is another way to get Major Resolve, and it also deals a little bit of damage when you kind of use it. It also has this sort of like Thorns ability, so anything that hits you with a direct damage attack within melee range gets a little bit of damage taken. So it's nice to increase your DPS just a little bit, which can help out a little bit. We've already covered Talons and Green Dragon Blood. Protective Plate or Dragonfire Scale, either morph is fine. Protective Plate gives you immunity to snares and mobilizations. Dragonfire Scale kind of deals damage to anything that hits you with a projectile. They both do have the 50% reduction for projectile damage, so they're both situationally useful. For example, in Cloud Rest, if you're the main tank tanking Zamaja, you can eat a Nocturnal's Favor using these two abilities pretty well and take pretty minimal damage overall. So really nice to have this option here if you're fighting a boss with a lot of projectiles. Then we have Deep Breath. This is for the interrupt. This is a very nice AoE interrupt. It has a radius of 8 meters, so really powerful move if you know you have to interrupt a couple of things and you're able to stay within that 8 meter radius as needed. Under the Earth and Heart line, Stone Giant is a little bit tricky to use, but you can still use it as a DK tank. This is mainly used for the stagger debuff, which increases damage taken by a flat amount, 65 per stack. You can get up to 3 stacks. So overall, fairly difficult to maintain as a DK tank, at least compared to how it was in Dragonhold, but it's still possible to maintain the full stagger debuff as a DK tank. It just requires you to really pay attention to when you're using Stone Giant. Usually you might have like a Stam DK running this, so you don't have to run this at all, but for a DK tank you might want to consider kind of learning how to use Stone Giant in order to get that stagger debuff if you're really trying to min-max your tank. Or we talked about Igneous Shield. And then we have, not Eruption, you want Cinderstorm, which is the healing morph of Ash Cloud. So this is another way to get Symphony of Blades and other sets that require you to heal other people to proc. This is an AoE, kind of ground AoE, so you do need to be able to place it down. And the radius is fairly small at 5 meters, so it is smaller than things like Springs, but it's still, you can still aim it fairly decently well, and when DPS are kind of clumped together, you will be able to hit pretty much all of them. So this is a fairly good heal. You can also just place it down on yourself. The heal is actually not terrible. It's 1k every second here before all of our buffs, so it's not bad, and it also lasts for a fairly long time, 18 seconds, so it's a pretty decent self-heal and healing ability just in general. Under the one-handed shield line, I do want to point out defensive postures, morphs, absorb missile, and defensive stance, both useful when you know you're fighting against something that's using projectile damage. So defensive stance gives you a little bit additional block mitigation and reflects the projectile. Absorb missile will heal you when you get hit by the projectile. They both give you a damage shield that will only absorb damage from projectiles. So they are both pretty nice options. They kind of fit different molds here. If you want more DPS, use defensive stance. If you want the heal, go for absorb missile. Most tanks, I should say, are usually going to end up running defensive stance, because situations where you are using this ability, you do want to reflect the projectile back in order to deal more damage to whatever's hitting you. Make sure to pick up shield charge. There is one fight in the game where you do want shield charge. That's the triplets in VHOF. If you want to pick a morph, go with shielded assault. That's going to fit you more as a tank because it gives you a damage shield. Under the destro staff line, if you're running the destro staff on the back bar, consider picking up crushing shock for the ranged interrupt and elemental drain for 4-man content for places where you have 1 tank 3 DPS. Next, under the armor line, you have Unstoppable and both of its morph, Immovable and Unstoppable Brute, which also provides you major resolve. They also do give you immunity to knockback and disabling effects, which is very useful, but you do get a reduction in movement speed, and it's actually fairly large, especially if you're running the immovable morph. So just keep that in mind if you are going to be using these abilities. Your movement speed's pretty much going to be reduced by a very large amount, so you just want to make sure you're aware of that. You can still dodge roll and things, but your actual movement is going to be fairly limited if you use this ability. Under the Fighters Guild line, you might want to consider picking up Ring of Preservation for minor protection, as well as a small self-heal. Not quite as useful as Ransack because it uses up almost 4 times as much stamina, but it's still a good option. It does give you minor endurance and a small self-heal as well, so could be useful to have on hand. Moving on to the Sigil Order line, you might want to consider picking up Meditate, or either Morph, Deep Thoughts, or Introspection. It basically gives you back resources as a channel, so you don't really need to sacrifice any sort of resources. Like if you're running balance, you got to sacrifice some health in order to get Magicka back. Now the downside of running these abilities is the fact that it's a channel, so you will not be able to block while getting your resources back. Now, you do have the passive Deliberation, which will give you 30% damage mitigation from major protection, but that's obviously not as strong as Block, which has you a base 50%. If you have other sort of passives, it's increased even further. So just bear that in mind before you start using Introspection or Deep Thoughts. If you want to run minor protection, and you don't necessarily want to run Ransack, you can run Temporal Guard instead, and just slot that there, and you get the minor protection. Under the Undaunted line, make sure to have all these abilities unlocked. Overflowing Altar for the Minor Lifesteal and the Blood Feast synergy. Shadow Silk for the Black Widow synergy. Even though it has been nerfed, it's still essentially free damage from a synergy. Already talked about the Ranged Taunt. Bone Surge for the Major Vitality synergy from the Spinal Surge synergy. Situationally useful, yes, but it's still potentially useful in those situations. And we also have already talked about Energy Orb. Under the Alliance War line, consider picking up Echoing Vigor as another way to proc healing sets. You can also pick up Razor Caltrops for an AoE Major Fracture, if you don't have another source of Major Fracture. So, for example, if you don't have a Necromancer running a Nerving Boneyard, or you don't have a Stamina Warden running Subterranean Assault, you can run Razor Caltrops to get Major Fracture on a bunch of things. Really great for trash pulls, but outside of that, not really all that useful. Then under the support line, we have Efficient Purge to help purge yourself and your group. And we already talked about Reviving Barrier. So that pretty much covers it for all of our skills. Now, how do you play a tank? Tanking in ESO pretty much covers a couple of things. So your first foremost job as a tank is to be a damage sponge. You taunt things, you keep it taunted on you, and you eat all the damage. That's, so that way your group members don't die. But once you have mastered that, you want to move on to looking at mastering your buff and debuff uptimes. So your buffs can come from abilities, come from sets. So you do want to pay attention to where you're getting your buffs and debuffs. So for example, I'm wearing, in this instance, Yolnakreen and Alkosh. So both of these sets give buffs and debuffs. So Yolnakreen gives me Minor Courage, which should be pretty easy to maintain because it lasts for 15 seconds and Taunt lasts for 15 seconds. So as long as I taunt things, I should be able to provide Minor Courage to everybody in the group. And then Alkosh activates on a synergy for 10 seconds. Synergies have 20-second cooldown, so I need to be able to time my synergies appropriately in order to make sure I have Alkosh up at all times. So if I have only 2 unique synergies, I have to be able to time them 10 seconds apart, so that way I will be able to maintain Alkosh uptime. If I have 3 or more, I'll be able to stagger them a little bit more reasonably, but it's still important to know when I want to activate a synergy in order to maximize my Alkosh uptime. And then for abilities, things like Engulfing Flames, if you're responsible for that, make sure to maintain that every 14 seconds and so on. And make sure to have Blockade down in order to get your enchant to proc on your backbar. So there's a lot of buffs and debuffs that you may or may not need depending on what sort of build you have. So if you're not running, for example, Alkosh, you don't need to worry about synergies and when you're taking them as much. But if you're running Torix Pact, then you need to pay more attention to when you're using Blockade in order to make sure you have that Crusher enchant active at all times. Tanking in general, like all support roles, really, it's hard to explain how to do it without actually showing you guys. I do have a lot of older streams where I played as a DK tank, so make sure to check those out to get an idea of how you want to approach tanking and how to tank in general. So definitely take a look at those past streams on my channel, and there are a couple of other content creators both on YouTube and on Twitch that do tank on DKs very often. Again, DKs are one of the most popular tanks and one of the best tanks in the game, so pretty much any tank that you see is fairly likely going to be a Dragonknight. But that pretty much concludes this video. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.